Reading the Times for Monday, January 27th, 2020. A seed in darkest winter. Reading the Times for Monday, January 27th, 2020. Trump tied Ukraine aid to inquiries he sought, Bolton Books says. The president's statement, as described by Mr. Bolton, could undercut a key element of his impeachment defense, that the holdup in aid was separate from Mr. Trump's request that Ukraine announce investigations into his perceived enemies, including former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and his son Hunter Biden, who had worked for a Ukrainian energy firm while his father was in office. Key to Mr. Bolton's account about Ukraine is an exchange during a meeting in August with the president after Mr. Trump returned from vacation at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey. Mr. Bolton raised the $391 million in congressional appropriated assistance to Ukraine for its war in the country's east against Russian-backed separatists. In his August 2019 discussion with Mr. Bolton, the president appeared focused on the theories Mr. Giuliani had shared with him, replying to Mr. Bolton's questions that he preferred sending no assistance to Ukraine until officials had turned over all materials they had about the Russian investigation and related to Mr. Biden and supporters of Mrs. Clinton in the Ukraine. Kobe Bryant, transformational star of the NBA, dies in helicopter crash. Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, hailed Mr. Bryant as one of the most extraordinary players in the history of our game. For 20 seasons, Kobe showed us what is possible when remarkable talent blends with an absolute devotion to winning. Mr. Silver said, adding that Mr. Bryant would be remembered most for inspiring people around the world to pick up a basketball and compete to the very best of their ability. John Altobelli, the baseball coach at Orange Coast Community in Costa Mesa, California, a community college 35 miles southeast of downtown Los Angeles, was also among the victims, the college announced on Saturday night when Mr. James, playing for the Lakers in a loss to the Philadelphia 76ers, passed Mr. Bryant on the career scoring list. He was wearing sneakers on which he had inscribed Mamba for life, a reference to Mr. Bryant's nickname. The son of a former NBA player, Mr. Bryant spent part of his childhood in Italy, where his father, Joe Bryant, known as Jelly Bean, spent the bulk of his pro career. As coronavirus fears intensify, effectiveness of quarantine is questioned. Technical difficulty. As coronavirus fears intensify. Okay. A top Chinese health official warned on Sunday that the spread of a dangerous new coronavirus, already extraordinarily rapid, is accelerating further, deepening global fears about an illness that has sickened more than 2,700 people worldwide and killed at least 80 people in China. The grim diagnosis came amid concerns that China's effort to contain the spread of the disease, despite a lockdown of unprecedented scope affecting 56 million people, may not only have come too late, but it could even make the situation worse, including by exacerbating shortages of medical supplies. We are actively investigating that possibility. Some global health experts said that China's focus and resources going forward should not be devoted to closing off cities. In coronavirus, a battle that could humble China's strongmen. Local officials downplayed the outbreak at the initial but crucial stage of the outbreak. The media was muzzled. The public was kept in the dark. As a result, valuable time was lost. The virus has sickened more than 2,800 people in China and a handful of other countries. The thing about China is that they can mobilize agencies and resources faster than anybody else can, said Richard McGregor, a senior fellow at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, an author of Xi Jinping, the Backlash. The other side of it is they can conceal things. In China, there's no independent entity that can get on the front foot and disseminate information, he added. China is a much more decentralized place than it appears, said David Cowhig, a former American diplomat who served 10 years in China and monitored health and science issues. In impeachment trial, geography dictates politics. Now, I'm all for Ukraine. I have friends that live in Ukraine, Mr. Trump said during an interview at Mar-a-Lago, his Florida golf resort. In an interview, Mr. Trump made no mention of corruption. Instead, he lumped Ukraine in with as many other examples he cited of nations that the United States supports while other countries freeload. The release over the weekend of a recording of Mr. Trump at a dinner in 2018 makes clear that the president understood early in his term that unless aid continued to Ukraine, it could be easily overrun, but without us. Not very long. What's missing from the record of Mr. Trump's manipulation to the aid to Ukraine last summer is any indication they sought an assessment from the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, or his own National Security Council over whether suspending American help might lead to the downfall of the Ukrainian government. After losing his legs to a bomb, Afghan veteran is on a new journey. The two men rigged a contraption that let Mr. Haydari guide the steering wheel with his intact right hand and the accelerator with his left thumb, which controls the lever. I've lost my legs, but not my mind. So Mr. Haydari plies the bumpy road of Bayman in the snow, trolling for fares, watching the expressions on the people who flag him down. Even after 5 years, Mr. Haydari remains haunted by the memories of the morning when he led a squad on a patrol in the Helmand province in southern Afghanistan, where the landmine awaited. Trump's Middle East plan is seen mainly as an election lift for Netanyahu. Less than a month after being sworn in, President Trump welcomed Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel to the White House with a bold promise. He would broker a peace accord between the Israelis and the Palestinians, a diplomatic unicorn that had eluded half a dozen of his predecessors. Mr. Kushner led a team that included Jason D. Greenblatt, the Trump Organization's former chief lawyer, and David M. Friedman, a bankruptcy lawyer with ties to the Jewish settler movement, who became Mr. Trump's ambassador to Israel. King Salman of Saudi Arabia was among those who condemned the decision, declaring East Jerusalem is an integral part of Palestinian territories. Mr. Trump reacted harshly to the Palestinian rejection. Okay. Brazil under Bolsonaro has message for teenagers: safe sex for marriage. We're making public policy based on religious beliefs. The government's emphasis on abstinence follows a presidential campaign in 2018 during which sex and sexuality was a dominant theme. Sex education programs that emphasize abstinence, Dr. Cantor said, have tended to exclude information pertinent to gay and bisexual people and provided misleading information about the efficacy of condoms and contraceptives. If you don't get it in school, you're not going to get it at the altar either. The abstinence campaign is being rolled out at a time when information about sex education and reproductive rights is being restricted in Brazil. Alert on Filipino volcano lowered as residents are cleared to return. The Philippines authorities on Sunday lowered the alert level at Taal volcano 2 weeks after it began spewing ash, steam, and rocks, a move that will allow many of the region's 376,000 displaced villagers to return home. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology said the volcano's condition had generally declined in less frequent volcanic earthquake activity, with weak stream and gas emissions in the main crater. The government's agency lowered the alert level from 4 to 3, which means that there is a decreased tendency toward the hazardous eruption, the Highest alert level, 5, would have indicated a major, much more dangerous eruption. Though it did not reach that level, people should brace for rapid evacuation. More than 376,000 people fled to safety from ash-blanketed towns and cities in hard-hit Batangas province after the volcano erupted. Italy election deals blow to nationalist leader Salvini. Today, Matteo Salvini has lost the election. Nicola Zingaretti, a leader of the Democratic Party, said after early results made clear the victory of his party's candidate, the region's incumbent. Until the very end, Mr. Zingaretti said Mr. Salvini campaigned to topple the government, but the government has come out stronger. The usually confident Mr. Salvini sounded remarkably low-key for a late-night news conference, calling himself proud of his party's performance and insisting he would work twice as hard going forward. The candidate backed by Mr. Salvini won in the southern region of Calabria, despite the fact that for decades, Mr. Salvini's party, formerly known as the Northern League, vilified the southern regions as lazy leeches on the wealthy and hard-working north. California confirms coronavirus patient making third case. The United States has confirmed a third case of the novel coronavirus after a traveler from China tested positive for the disease in Orange County, California. The Orange County Healthcare Agency, which received information of the case in California from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, said in a statement on Saturday that the person was sent to the hospital and was in good condition. The patient is a traveler from Wuhan, China. There's no evidence that person-to-person transmission has occurred in Orange County, according to the agency. As China struggles to contain the outbreak of the deadly pneumonia-like virus, global authorities are grappling with a rising number of cases at their borders. The person in California brings to 3 the number of confirmed cases in the United States. North Korea's leader's aunt reemerges after her husband's execution. North Korea's state-run media said Kim Kyung-hui, the only sister of Mr. Kim's father, Kim Jong-il, accompanied Kim Jong-un to an orchestra performance on Saturday for a Lunar New Year's Day. Mr. Kim's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, is still revered like a god among North Koreans. After Kim Kyung-hui disappeared from public view, Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, and his wife, Ri Sol-ju, replaced her as the main female face of the family. Demeaned and humiliated, what happened to these Iranians at U.S. airports. At the airport, officers wanted to know why a former school email address and an old research paper he had written were not disclosed on his visa application. Officers asked him for his opinion on political events in Iran, whether he thought Iran was doing the right thing. He was asked what he thought about the Ukrainian jet that had been shot down 3 days earlier by 2 Iranian missiles. An officer had a series of questions, she said, like which ships Iran hid weapons in and why Iran had captured a British oil tanker in July. 5 takeaways on Trump and Ukraine from John Bolton's book. President Trump directly tied withholding of almost $400 million in American security aid to investigations that he sought from Ukrainian officials, according to an unpublished manuscript of a book that John R. Bolton, Mr. Trump's former national security advisor, wrote about his time in the White House. In their opening arguments on Saturday, Mr. Trump's trial, the president's lawyers asserted that Mr. Trump had legitimate concerns about corruption in Ukraine and whether other countries were offering enough to help for its war against Russian-backed separatists, which his lawyers said explained his reluctance to release the aid. Mr. Trump replied that he preferred sending no assistance to Ukraine until the officials had turned over all materials that they had about the Russian investigation related to Mr. Biden and supporters of Hillary Clinton in Ukraine, referencing unfounded theories and other assertions that Rudolph W. Giuliani, his personal lawyer, has promoted about any Ukrainian effort to damage Mr. Trump politically. Schiff, calling Trump wrathful and vindictive, sees tweet as a threat. Mr. Schiff's comments on the NBC program Meet the Press came as Mr. Trump's legal team planned to resume its defense of the president when the Senate reconvenes Monday at 1 p.m. Look at the president's tweets about me today, saying that I should pay a price, Mr. Schiff said on Meet the Press. Do you take that as a threat? Asked Chuck Todd, the show's host. Once Mr. Trump's defense team wraps up its case, Senators will have an opportunity to question and then vote on whether to call witnesses or subpoena new documents. Some Republicans are floating the idea of a witness swap in which they would call either former Vice President Joseph R. Biden or his son Hunter Biden, both of whom Mr. Trump wanted Ukraine to investigate, even though neither has direct knowledge of Mr. Trump's behavior. Recording shows that the swamp has not been drained. The latest evidence came over the weekend with the release of a secret recording of an April 18th dinner for major donors and prospective donors to a super PAC supporting Mr. Trump. While news of the recording primarily focused on Mr. Trump's call for the removal of Mary L. Yovanovitch, an ambassador to Ukraine, after a donor claimed she had disparaged the president, the recording revealed that Mr. Trump engaged in policy discussions with many other donors pushing their own agendas. Held in a private suite on April 30th, 2018, it was for donors and prospective donors to the First America First Action, a super PAC that has raised nearly $50 million to support Mr. Trump and allied candidates. Bloomberg warns of anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head. Michael R. Bloomberg on Sunday addressed rising anti-Semitism and spoke personally of his Jewish heritage in a speech at a prominent synagogue near Miami, a sign that courting Jewish voters is core to his strategy of building support in Florida. The speech on Jewish identity was an unusual move for Mr. Bloomberg, a secular Jew who has not been religiously observant. Seeing the trauma of what happened in Venezuela made me realize we can't be glib about thinking crazy things couldn't happen here. Bloomberg is by far the one I have the most confidence putting my trust in. Debbie Picker, who splits her time between her Westchester County and Fort Lauderdale, Florida, said she was disappointed Mr. Bloomberg hadn't taken questions on Sunday and wanted to know how he planned to elevate his profile in the race. Fact-checking Joe Biden before the Iowa caucuses. A January poll conducted by the Washington Post and Ipsos, a nonpartisan research firm, found that Mr. Biden had a wide lead among black Democrats with 48% of support, but Mr. Sanders led with those between ages 18 to 34 with a 42% spread, while Mr. Biden places second at 30%. His account is backed by a former president of the state chapter of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People and a former president of the Delaware AFL-CIO, a 1987 edition of Current Biography Yearbook, a magazine that profiles American figures, noted that Mr. Biden had participated in anti-segregation sit-ins at Wilmington's Town Theater during his high school years. During his first bid for president, Mr. Biden wrongly said in 1987 that he had marched with tens of thousands of others in the civil rights movement. Later, a spokesman for Mr. Biden clarified that he had participated in actions to desegregate one restaurant and one movie theater. Mr. Biden himself conceded that I was not an activist. I worked at an all-black swimming pool in the east side of Wilmington, Delaware. I was involved in what they were thinking, what they were feeling, but I was not out there marching. He said in a news conference that fall. T-minus 8 days, a frenetic weekend on the trail in Iowa. Women candidates have been outperforming men candidates since Donald Trump was elected. Mr. Sanders and Mr. Biden continue to spar with each other, each seeing that the other, justifiably based on recent polls, as his biggest threat. At an event in Perry on Sunday, Mr. Sanders shot back at Mr. Biden for his remarks a couple days earlier that not a single solitary scientist considered Mr. Sanders' climate plan workable. Many leading scientists agree with our plan, and in a few days, we're going to have a long list of scientists who agree with our plan, Mr. Biden. In Des Moines, Mr. Biden drew voters' attention to what is arguably his biggest strength nationally, his strong support from black voters. When historic preservation hurts cities. There are now more than 2,300 local historic districts across the United States. I know many people who would like to have their own neighborhood frozen in time. The mandarins of historic preservation and the good many in my neighborhood regard allowing people to install rooftop solar panels with the kind of horror they usually reserve for, say, anachronistic window frames. The list certainly doesn't include all 8,000 buildings in the Capitol Hill Historic District. hubris on the campaign trail. In 2008, New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg was barred by term limits from seeking 4 more years in office. The number of stops rose for years until Mr. Bloomberg peaking at 685,724 stops in 2011, according to police data published by the New York City Civil Liberties Union. Mr. Bloomberg has also declined to release from confidentiality agreements several women who brought accusations of a hostile work environment at his company, Bloomberg LP. Mr. Bloomberg has much to offer. Iowa should never go first again. The Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary owe their first-in-the-nation status partly to circumstance. Iowa caucuses are first in the nation mainly because the state insists on remaining first, Kathy Obradovich, a prominent Iowa journalist, has said. A typical voter in Iowa or New Hampshire has up to 20 times more influence than somebody in later voting states. One study found a seed in darkest winter. Somewhere along the way, I stopped hating winter. A shivering beech tree in a damp winter forest gives off its own light in the same way that a dogwood blossoms in springtime. In the same way that a dogwood blossoms. A shivering beech tree in a damp winter forest gives off its own light in the same way that dogwood blossoms in springtime look like tiny ground-born suns. Thank you. The winter of old returned last week to pay a visit. America, the idea, is lost. The idea of America that most of us have come to embrace, that of a functioning democracy responsible and responsive to its citizens who are entitled to vote and whose votes are equal, is lost. The founders of this country never intended for everyone to vote, and they didn't even include a right to vote in the Constitution. Everything from who can vote, how they vote, who influences that vote, who is elected by that vote, and who is accountable having been voted in, is broken. Reporters face new threats from the governments they cover. When Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, was charged last year by the Trump administration in connection with the publication of secret United States government documents nearly a decade earlier, many journalists expressed deep concern about the dangerous precedent the case could set for investigative reporting in America. Under his leadership, WikiLeaks both published the documents itself and also shared many of the leaked documents with other major news organizations, including the New York Times. His later involvement in the Trump-Russia case in 2016, WikiLeaks obtained and released emails and other documents from the Clinton presidential campaign and the Democratic National Committee from a hacker believed to be a front for Russian intelligence, transformed Mr. Assange into an even more incendiary character with little public support. Examining the Christian idea of hell. For David Bentley Hart, hell is God's eternal torture chamber that served as a method of control for less enlightened people and remains a source of perverse satisfaction to the obstinately religious. Hell, a fiery domain of eternal damnation, is burned into the psyche of evangelical and other Christians from the very youth. Could one not rather conceive of hell as a way station of refinement and purification for those transitioning to paradise? David Bentley Hart rightly says the biblical support for the conscious eternal torment is scant. I wonder why. Are you losing your memory or not? Governor Andrew M. Cuomo Governor Andrew M. Cuomo's ambitious plan to create an Empire State Complex surrounding Penn Station, including adding tracks south to the station if the Gateway project happens or not, overshoots the opportunity to create an architecturally significant modern transportation center and public space akin to Grand Central Terminal in New York, Union Station in Washington, or St. Pancras Station in London. A more cost-effective use of large sums of money needed to buy a city block south of the station and placing unnecessary additional tracks there would be to pursue conversion of the entirety of the existing Penn Station track plan to a through station as opposed to a partly terminal one. We appreciate Mr. Governor Andrew M. Cuomo's desired again expansion project. We appreciate Governor Andrew M. Cuomo's desired again expansion project done at Penn Station. There are 6 women who are testifying against Harvey Weinstein. That title didn't sound right. Miss Mann ended up giving him a massage instead. Prosecutors said Mr. Weinstein invited Miss Mann to parties held by the Weinstein Company, his production studio, and he followed up with her about acting. Mr. Weinstein, prosecutors said, claimed he had to prepare a speech that he had given for Quentin Tarantino at an event that night, and asked the woman to come up to his apartment to finish the conversation. Still, Miss Wolf agreed to meet with him at his company's office to discuss a potential role in Pulse, a new movie that was being produced by Mr. Weinstein's brother, Robert Weinstein, in Los Angeles. Top Latino mayoral hopeful in New York City drops out. Although the Democratic primary for mayor is more than a year away, Mr. Diaz seemed to be ceding ground to his rivals. I'm at peace with it, yeah. Carl Heastie, the New York State Assembly Speaker and close friend of Mr. Diaz, he said he was disappointed not to see the Bronx Borough president become the next mayor. Mr. Diaz echoed Mr. Del Duca's sentiment, quickly adding, I'm giving the money back. Who does that? His defection from the mayor's race will still leave one member of his family in politics, his father, Ruben Diaz Sr., a Pentecostal minister who opposes same-sex marriage and has a history of anti-gay remarks, is a city councilman running for Congress. Before Trump rally in New Jersey, Justice Department joins local immigrations case. The Justice Department on Friday joined a lawsuit that seeks to overturn a state directive that has been in effect for nearly a year that limits how much local law enforcement can cooperate with federal immigration authorities. Mr. Gruhl said the directive has played an important role in ensuring that victims and witnesses come forward and report crimes to law enforcement without fear of deportation. He added the federal government's efforts to coerce states into implementing its immigration agenda have failed repeatedly in the past. Will respond to the latest efforts in the court at the appropriate time. Issued in November 2018, the State Attorney General's directive laid out rules limiting the extent to which local and state law enforcement agencies can assist federal civil immigration enforcement efforts. In New Jersey, most local law enforcement officers have supported the Attorney General's directive, which went into effect last March, saying that it has helped reassure immigrants that they can interact with law enforcement without risk of deportation. Worried reporters make a plea. Please buy our paper. The 2 reporters have also made an appeal to Patrick Soon-Shiong, the billionaire medical industry entrepreneur who bought the Los Angeles Times and other California papers from Tribune Publishing in 2018 for $500 million after prolonged tensions between the Times editorial staff and Tribune executives. The prospects include the Abell Foundation, endowed by the namesake family owned the Sun. The prospects include the Abell Foundation, endowed by the namesake family that owned the Sun until its 1986 sale to Times Mirror, a newspaper company that merged with Tribune's publishing predecessor in 2000. Without forming a union, he added, we would have never gotten the new owner. In 2018, Tribune Publishing cut the newsroom staff of the Daily News in New York in half. Your credit score may soon change. Here's why. The new scores reflected nuanced changes in consumer credit trends that we observed from our analysis of millions of credit files, said David Schellenberger, Vice President of Product Management at FICO, whose scores generally range from 300 to 850. Why change scores now? FICO adjusts its scores every few years, drawing on consumer behavior and patterns that emerge from a vast trove of data it tracks. You want to get your credit card balances down to multiple months in advance, or at least have them trending down for months in a row, and then have balances at a low before you apply. Your runway needs to be long now. Despite tweaks, the 5 broad factors that drive your FICO score haven't changed. The myth of the urban boomer. While there has been notable increase in urban living among higher income young adults, rich older people are less likely to live in urban neighborhoods in 2018 than their counterparts in 2000, even with a very slight increase since 2012. Why do we keep encountering articles about the urban Ulster? In Chicago and Harvard and Atlanta, several understandable reasons. Of course, the population of people that age is growing even faster outside of urban neighborhoods, which is just another way of saying that boomers are less urban than older adults used to be. The week in tech, a tech mogul's phone, and the Saudi crown prince. In response, the Saudi embassy in Washington said that the idea that the kingdom had hacked Mr. Bezos' cell phone was absurd. Our reporter unearthed more details. A forensic analysis report included 2 examples at which the crown prince appeared to send Mr. Bezos messages that suggested he could read the tech executive's private communications. They pointed out that at the time, MBS sent Mr. Bezos the video. Mr. Khashoggi's columns at the Post increasingly raised concerns about the crown prince's rule. Do you have any advice for That's crazy. Site that ran anti-Semitic remarks got passes for Trump trip. One media outlet stood out, True News, a website aimed at conservative Christians whose founder, a pastor named Rick Wiles, recently described Mr. Trump's impeachment as a Jew coup planned by a Jewish cabal. 5 employees of True News, which is based in Florida, received formal credentials from the White House to cover President's trip. Mr. Wiles said in an interview last week from his hotel in Switzerland, a room in ski lodge reserved by the Trump administration for traveling members of the American press. We want to thank President Trump and the White House for extending the invitation to be here, Mr. Wiles said in a video from Davos. We're on a list of media organizations at the White House, and from time to time they send out notices that there are events taking place. Mr. Wiles said, adding that his team also covered Mr. Trump's visit to NATO summits and the Group of 20 gatherings. Does personal finance still work in our challenging economy? People have criticized financial education, saying it doesn't work because people are still making mistakes, said Bill Helmsley, president and CEO at National Endowment for Financial Education, a private nonprofit. Traditional personal finance advises people to pay off debt before making any other major financial decision, sometimes even including investing for their retirement. But that might not be realistic for many people who are faced with years of paying off student loans. What we're seeing when people cash out their retirement plan or borrow from them or fail to save for an emergency is not a lack of knowledge or awareness, but the result of people genuinely needing to spend the money today. An Adult's Guide to Social Skills for those who never were taught. Young people tend to learn how to manage their own emotions, recognize those of other people, and manage them both effectively by socializing. We'll go over some common scenarios even adults might struggle with, but keep in mind how these principles can apply in all situations. While most tricks on how to combat this involve managing how you talk, pausing in the middle of a sentence rather than the end, or finishing your sentence even if someone tries to interrupt. An often overlooked issue is managing how you react to being talked over. And that is Reading the Times for Monday, January 27th, 2020.